not cuss as I record. At least I will try not to. Okay. We've already looked at the last couple of classes and how the Europeans expanded their control over most of the world. We looked at Latin America, economic control, indirect control in the case of America, invading countries temporarily and occupying them temporarily. We looked at modern East Asia and how Japan was completely humiliated. And we looked at China, and we looked at Japan and how it was forced to modernize because of its humiliation when the Americans and then other nations came and demanded access to their markets. Today I want to talk about what most people remember and know of and hear of as imperialism, which is the colonization of Africa. And I'm going to use that as a springboard to talk about the origins of World War I. Because the colonization, the complete conquest of virtually every square inch of Africa except for Liberia under American protection and Ethiopia, the only nation that survived European invasion, that happened at a time when there was increasing competition amongst European nations, political competition, economic competition, etc. And this translated into hostilities that would lead eventually to World War I. 1914 to 1918. Now, why is World War I so important? There's a variety of reasons for this. First of all, the sheer loss of life. Nearly 40 million casualties, dead, missing, and wounded. And by wounded, I'm talking about wounds that you can't recover from. Lost limbs, deaf, blind, burns, and most often, post-traumatic stress syndrome, where you simply can't re-enter regular life because of the trauma of war, okay? Now, the other deaths are tracked to the Spanish influenza, the first flu. Every year, including this year, when you get a flu shot, all right, the press will say the name of this variation of the flu is H47N53. What does that mean? Those are variations from the original Spanish influenza that goes all the way back to 1917, 1918, spread globally over a few years, and killed upwards of 40 million dead for sure. But we suspect it could be as high as 100 million because we don't know exactly why those other people died, whether it was influenza or something caused by war and the influenza just made them weaker, etc., etc., etc. World War I was also critical because it set the stage and launched the Russian Revolution, which brought communism to power in Russia in 1917, and it only fell in the early 1990s. And communism in Russia was part of the Cold War, which at times led us to the brink of nuclear extinction. And what's going on in Russia now is in many ways a sort of hangover from the Cold War. Whether it's accurate or not, that's how it's being perceived. And finally, World War II. There is no such thing as World War II without the experience of World War I. Why? Because at the end of World War I, both the winners and the losers were quite unsatisfied with what they got. And it set in motion the rise of fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and appeasement, or not wanting to go to war on the part of France, America, and Britain, which allowed the dictators to increase their power, and eventually war was the only way to stop their expansion. So, first off, imperialism, the expansion of European power in the 19th century. During the 19th century, Europe carved up Africa, conquered India, dominated China, revolutionized Japan, and dominated Latin America, either economically by Europe or militarily by the United States. This was the result of actual colonial conquest in the continent of Africa. That's what Africa looked like in as late as 1876. All of this territory in the middle, this lightish brown, is independent. Okay? The other small pieces represent actual colonies, like the original 13 colonies in the United States by Britain, Britain had actually colonized, put in settlers, controlled the territory in the south. Portugal on each end. Let's see. The French in Algeria and Senegal, and very little else. Everything else in the middle is independent. 1876. By 1914, or World War I, everything except for Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east conquered. The red represents all of Britain. From Cape Colony, that's what they started with. All the red is what they got in about 25 years. The purple, France. Start off with Senegal, Algeria, took over most of West Africa. The Italians take Libya, Somaliland. The Belgians, a very small nation, take the entire, the Congo River Basin becomes the basis of modern-day Belgium. The Portuguese also increase their colonies, their size, and the Germans get involved. And the French also take Madagascar. And this is just Africa. So, how? That is the question. How did this all happen? There's a variety of things to look at. First off, and they're all traceable back to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution allowed these nations, European nations and the U.S., or the West, to dominate globally. They had wealth and power at home, and they were able to project it overseas. So, for instance, weaponry. These nations had modern rifles, cannon, ships, eventually planes, machine guns that were simply unstoppable when fighting against native armies. Even the most advanced, the most successful, the most well-trained armies of Africa, like the Zulus of South Africa, ferociously brave, no fear at all, but charging headlong into trained professional British soldiers who are all trained to stand, aim, and fire without blinking, you're going to lose. Just like the modern armies defeated the Japanese samurai, the modern armies that were easy to transport all over Africa defeated all native armies. Transportation. The Europeans and the Americans had the jump on this. They had steamships that allowed them to navigate rivers. They built railroads in their colonies so that they could actually administer and travel and exploit vast stretches of land. Communication. The 19th century is the era of the birth of the telegraph and eventually the telephone. Once you lay telegraph wires, everybody know what a telegraph is? Where you communicate by dots and dashes? Morse code. Once you establish telegraph communications from the home countries in either Europe or America to Africa or Asia or further Far East, you have instantaneous communication. You have orders given in London and put into practice by soldiers in Africa or anywhere else around the world. It is a grand global coordinated strategy. Science. The Industrial Revolution made the West superior in science, and specifically medical science. One of the things that kept the Europeans from conquering every square inch of Africa earlier than the late 19th century, they didn't have to. They didn't need it. The need for resources wasn't apparent. The slaves that they acquired were oftentimes captured during wars in the interior, brought to the coast, where Europeans, Americans would come, buy them, and then sell them overseas. But also disease. Once you penetrated deeper into tropical, subtropical Africa, there are certain animals, insects, disease. Europeans just did not have immunity. We hear about the West Nile virus every year in this city, and they're spraying always because they're mosquito-borne diseases. Well, malaria, mosquito-borne disease are common in tropical temperatures, like Africa, Central and Southern Africa. As such, you simply can't go there without, dying. But the Industrial Revolution, advances in medical science, bring us a medicine or it's called quinine, Quinine. which allowed for the conquest of malaria and the deep penetration of Africa by Europeans. And finally, the West, specifically the Europeans, because the Americans weren't colonizing Africa, they were busy in the Pacific and Latin America. But the West in general had this belief of their superiority to be able to conquer everybody and anybody. Not only can they do it, but they should do it. And so they really didn't allow anything to hold them back. So what you have at the end of the 19th century is what's known as new imperialism. The old imperialism is how America was born. The British put colonists in the 13 colonies. They put them in Canada. The French put them in Quebec. They put them in Haiti, some in Haiti. The Spanish put them in, there were Spanish settlers in the American West, Central and South America. This was the old imperialism in the 14 and 1700s. The idea was actually transporting your culture, your people overseas to set up a new England, new France, new Amsterdam, new Spain. By the late 19th century, the new imperialism takes over, which was less and less to do about actually colonizing and setting up whole communities. It's about conquering and exploiting resources. You put as little people there as you need, because it costs money to set up an actual functioning colony. You put in troops, you put in administrators, and you simply exploit the population and the resources as much as possible. How does this work? It starts off slowly. You have all these demands for new investment, new markets because of the Industrial Revolution. Europe needs new markets. It needs access to natural resources. It can't spread into Europe or America because those nations have already put up protective barriers. They don't want any interference in their economy, any competition. But Africa, Asia, Latin America, much weaker politically, militarily, and in many cases welcomed foreign investment. So it starts off slow. You build new industries, you hire the locals, but slowly and surely you have this transformation of a culture. When you introduce modern products, modern discipline, labor standards, modern cultures, it transforms and makes the native populations dependent. It makes them dependent also on foreign investment for the success of their economy. And once you have them hostage, then you justify interfering in those foreign lands, to protect, well, mostly to protect your investment, to protect your access to natural resources. Why? Why in the latter quarter of the 19th century did Europeans and then the Americans become so fever-struck with wanting to conquer, possess, and exploit 1/5 of the world's population? 1/5 of the world's population one-fifth of the world's land was conquered by Europeans by the 1900s. Think about that. 1/5 of all the land in the entire world and 1/10 the entire population was controlled by Europeans, a very small part of the world. Why'd they do it? Because this stuff costs money. There's been a variety of reasons to explain why the West decided to impose this type of control over most of the world. You have the economic answer, put forward by Karl Marx originally, and then expanded by Vladimir Lenin. And it was a simple argument. Capitalism expands. That's the only way capitalism survives. You knock out your competition, you take over their market share, you expand. Eventually, once you've knocked out all competition and you've dominated the market at home, you need new markets, access to new raw materials. Well, you can't go to your neighbors because they've got protective tariffs. So where are you going to go? Africa, Asia, Latin America, where those nations aren't strong enough to stop you. This is a very good theory for explaining imperialism. But it only explains why people went in. It doesn't explain why people stayed when they got there and they realized there's no oil here, there's no gold, there's no coal, there's nothing here. but they stayed. There's really no reason to colonize the Sahara Desert, as France did, but they did it. They administered it. They held on to it for years, but there's very little natural resources there. But they stayed. There was the often stated cultural motivation. Many imperial powers, the first people on the ground were either sort of explorers that were more or less independent, maybe businessmen, but oftentimes missionaries. People that were out to convert the backward natives to whatever religion they were pushing. Catholicism, Protestant, various Protestant sects, whatever the case may be. But these missionaries always, always, always have the protection of their governments. So, and it's sort of like the first wave of going in. The religious motivation I just covered. Social policy motivation. This is the reason why you stay in a colony once you're in. All right? Foreign policy successes distract people from contemporary problems. Okay? Every day we go to work, we go to school, pick up our kids, take care of this, take care of that, fighting with our partners, blah, 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 blah. Right? It's like every day is a challenge to deal with that stuff. Are we making enough money? Am I doing okay in my classes? Can I pay for my kids this, that, etc.? Those are real everyday reminders of what responsibilities we have. How do we get distracted from that? When something much, 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 much bigger happens. When 9/11 happened, nobody was worrying about their day-to-day responsibilities and classes, etc., etc. Right? It was this big thing. Some of you may have lost people in 9/11. Most of my students did not. But it still affected us. And we didn't think about anything else. Then there was the war in Afghanistan, followed by the war in Iraq. Distraction. And none of this stuff directly affected you until much later, in indirect ways. This type of foreign policy distraction was incredibly effective in the 19th century when you had workers demanding more rights and the right to unionize. You had women demanding more rights, equal rights to the vote, etc., etc. And these foreign policy successes, coloring in the map of Africa with the color red for Britain, blue for France, displayed in the newspapers as the advance of French or British or German civilization, it raised national and patriotic feelings and made people support their government. And this went on for years. Now, one of the most critical ones is always going to be strategy. And for that, let me stop for a second and let me go to you. Let me go to Eileen before I take any more of your thunder. I asked you all to read for me Jules Ferry and his speech to the French National Assembly on why we should have colonies, the French. So Eileen, tell me a little bit about Jules Ferry, and you are being recorded, and just give me a brief, what you have on his reasons why France should have colonies.
Okay, I'm going to give you the biography.
Okay.
Ferry Jules, 1832 to 1893, French statesman, a member of government of national defense established after the defeat of Emperor Napoleon III in the Franco-Prussian War.
Prussian,
there you go, thank you. 1870 through 71. He later rose to prominence as Minister of Public Instruction, 1879 through 82. He was twice premier. Ferry established the modern French educational system with universal, free, and compulsory education in the primary schools. He secularized the public schools, abolishing religious education in them and burying members of Roman Catholic orders as public school teachers. Ferry is best known, however, as the builder of the French colonial empire. An exponent of imperialism, he was willing to cooperate with the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in order to secure French expansion overseas. During his premiership, the French occupied Tunis, entered Tonkin and Madagascar, and penetrated the regions of the Niger and the Congo. Ferry was overthrown after a temporary French defeat in Indochina. He was assassinated by a religious fanatic.
Very good. Can you give me a brief highlight as to why he thinks France should have colonies?
Sure. He delivered a speech promoting colonial expansion in Africa and Asia. He was defending three major points, which were the political, economical, and the moral justice of expansion. Economic was needed for industry, export markets, and for access of industrial products. Moral justice of expansion was about civilizing the savages, since rich people had the means to educate them. Politics and patriotism, Ferry said was good for power, naval power increase, providing the necessity of stations, shelters, and posts for defense and supply room for a growing population, since it is a matter of patriotism. His intentions were to raise awareness of the duty of superior races and inspire the French people to overtake powerful nations, but becoming aware of the rising powers around them. His language was written in a very clear and organized format to his audience, which were the French Parliament, to convey an influential yet convincing tone. His listeners were educated and powerful, which were the French Chamber of
Deputies.
Deputies. Yeah, there you go.
There it is. You done?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much. So, one thing that was in Ferry's article that I think we need to highlight, though, he makes a very clear reference to, at the end of his article, the first-ranked nations, the second-ranked nations, the third-ranked nations, the fourth-ranked nations, and he says, listen, in modern times, in a nutshell, you either conquered and show yourself as a strong, powerful nation, or you open yourself up to conquest by others. This is the era of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, not just species, but countries. Everybody competes. It is a natural part of human existence. It is a natural part of history. You either beat or get beaten. And the argument that Jules Ferry makes is based on a racial superiority of whites that have both the obligation and should be dominating, quote-unquote, less civilized races, black, yellow, brown, whatever, because that's how they saw the world. Now, strategically, you have to expand to protect what you have, is what I'm talking about over here. For instance, Britain started off with Egypt. It colonized Egypt in 1882 in order to protect its access to the Suez Canal, and I'll show you a map in a moment. But in order to protect its Egyptian colony, it moved south and conquered the Sudan. And then to protect trade along the whole Nile River, it just kept conquering land surrounding the Nile River until it got to the beginning of the Nile River, hundreds of miles away. France, it went into Algeria in 1830 in order to stop pirate raids on French shipping. It then colonized Algeria, but then it took over neighboring Tunisia because the Italians were threatening to take over that land. Germany had no interest in colonies, but they didn't want to be left out, and they wanted to use them as bargaining positions in their negotiations with other European nations. So they took over some colonies. And then Britain and South Africa. It started off with very little territory at the very bottom of South Africa, the Cape Colony. But over time, in order to defend the Cape Colony against what's known as the Boers or the Afrikaans, a mixture of European, long-term Dutch European settlers in South Africa that did not want to live under British rule. In order to bring them under control, in order to protect the Cape Colony from troubles on the borders, and also to guarantee access to the gold and diamonds found in the territory just north of the Cape Colony, Britain conquered all of that land to create the modern-day Republic of South Africa. All of this conquest was made much, much easier in 1884, 1885 by what's known as the Berlin West Africa Conference. Everybody realized that with all these Europeans running around conquering territory in Africa, eventually the French, the British, the Germans were all going to run into each other, and these are soldiers. If they start shooting each other in Africa, that's going to translate into war in Europe. And nobody wants to have a war over some part of Africa that people have never even heard of up until we have a problem. So the Europeans got together, and the Americans, they sat down in Berlin, Germany, and said, we need rules for the conquest of Africa. One simple rule: effective occupation. What does that mean? It means you can't have one guy with a flag way off in the middle of the continent and says, all of this is for France. No. You need a guy to explore. You need to actually occupy. You have to conquer. You have to set up railroads. You have to actually administer the territory. What does that mean? Now that everybody had the rules, which was if you get there first and you show you effectively occupy, everybody else is a back off. Well, all of a sudden, you go from that, where everybody is sort of on the coast, to this, where everyone just shoots as far as possible until they run up to their neighbor. Then they draw a line on a map, end of story. And much of these borders are the modern borders of African nations today, created out of strategic necessity at the end of the 19th century with no regard to hundreds of thousands of years of history of peoples living there. All right? So, all of this translates into a lot of competition for markets and for land overseas, which eventually is brought home to Europe. And one thing leads to another for a variety of things I'm going to talk about now, which leads to World War I. What happened? Where am I? Yes. Okay. The first thing that happened that takes simple competition amongst nations, which has always happened, into the competition on steroids, which leads to World War I, is the unification of Germany. When Germany is unified, that big chunk of land in the middle of Europe that people for generations, nations for generations had taken for granted, they had fought their wars there because it wasn't unified. The governments there were too weak to resist invasion. So the French, the Russians, the Swedes, the Danish, they all fought their wars right there in the middle of Europe, German lands. For years it was ravaged, war after war after war. And then it was unified in 1870 by Otto von Bismarck after 3 wars, one with Denmark, one with Austria, one with France. And all of a sudden, in the middle of Europe, where you used to have a weak nation, now you have a unified territory, unified by the most powerful military in Europe, the Prussian army. That military culture expands to all of Germany, and now all of those German lands are unified economically, and Germany begins its industrial revolution, and it just explodes. So from 1870 to 1900, 30 short years, you go from a part of the world which is easily ignored and victimized to the most powerful military and economic center in the world. Germany and America are sort of rising and beating everybody else who had industrialized earlier. In terms of military power, Germany far outshone America. But in unifying Germany, France was defeated and humiliated, and they wanted revenge. This hostility eventually leads to alliances which turn all of Europe into 2 armed camps. And these 2 armed camps, always suspicious of each other, once you add in some diplomatic problems, it explodes into war. So how the hell did we go from a Europe in 1870 where there were no alliances to a Europe in 1914 when World War I broke out, where every major nation is in an alliance and is committed to fighting with their allies if their treaty obligations kick in? Because how does World War I happen? One small event happens in one small part of Europe, but because it involves so many other people through alliances, everybody jumps in and you have a world war. So how does that happen? How do people get into these alliances that are so troublesome? First off, this is the European alliance system in 1914. The greens are one side, the purple are the other side. They fought each other in World War I. But this is all I want you to focus on right now for the sake of simplicity. Britain, France, and Russia are all going to be allied leading up to World War I. Germany, Austria, and Italy. I know Italy's not the same color, but they switched sides at the beginning of World War I. I'll talk about that later. But Germany, Austria, and Italy are another alliance that forms leading up to World War I. So just geographically, look at this. Britain, France, Russia on the outside, Germany, Austria, Italy in the middle. All right? This is geographically how Europe breaks down as the alliances start forming. How do we get there? You start off with Bismarck. Bismarck's primary job was, now that Germany was unified, keep France isolated because he doesn't want another war. He wants to rebuild Germany, no more wars. But France wants a war. They want revenge. But they're not going to do it on their own because they just had their behinds kicked convincingly by the German army. France will only go to war if they have friends. Who can they be friends with? Well, the British don't care about Europe because they have their empire. They don't want to get involved in European affairs. So France can look to Italy, kind of weak, not a big problem. They can look to Austria, probably not much connection there. And they can look to Russia, again, not that much connection there. So Bismarck goes out of his way to bring together all the people that France could ally with. And he does a couple of things, but some of them stick, some don't work. At first he tried unifying the Germans, the Austrians, and the Russians because he thought, well, you're all monarchies, you're all conservative, you all have that in common, you should be friends. The problem is the Austrians and the Russians are competing for the same territory in Europe. So they have a lot in common, but they really can't stand each other. That first group, the Three Emperors League, falls apart in 1878. Russia went to war with the Ottoman Empire. They won. Everybody was afraid of Russia getting too big. And so Austria, Britain, France, everybody said to the Russians, you've got to give back the land you just conquered. So that Three Emperors League collapses. So Bismarck is nervous. I need to isolate France. What can I do? He forms the dual alliance with Austria. Germany and Austria formed the dual alliance in 1879. So at least one nation is allied to Germany. And the dual alliance is simple. If France attacks Germany, Austria is going to help out and protect Germany. If the Russians attack if the Russians attack Austria, Germany will help out. Now, I'll give you a map and explain that in a second. Well, now the Russians are feeling lonely. They have no allies, no friends. Bismarck knows that. He doesn't want them going to France. So he reaches out to Russia and he says, secretly, I'm going to sign a reinsurance treaty with you. Meaning, if you go to war with Austria, we have promised the Austrians that we will help them. But we're promising you that we won't. What do you say? Plus, we'll open up trade negotiations with you so that you have access to German grain and so on and so forth. The Russians were on board. So even though this was contrary to the dual alliance, it doesn't matter. Bismarck did what he wanted. You got the Austrians in an alliance, the Russians in another alliance, and in 1882, he also sucks in the Italians. The Italians were upset because they lost territory in Africa. They knew they were weak by themselves, and they lost territory to the French. So they say to the Germans and Austrians, we want to be part of the dual alliance. Bismarck says yes, and the dual alliance becomes the triple alliance. So now Bismarck, in a few short years, has isolated France. The British are not a problem. They don't care. Russians, Austrians, Italians, all allied to Germany. France is by itself, not a threat to Germany. Brilliant statesmanship. So then what the hell happened? This guy happened. Carla, you're up. Kaiser Wilhelm II. Hang on. Up here, can't hear you, so speak loudly, please.
Kaiser Wilhelm was born on August 27, 1859, and died June 4, 1941. He was a German emperor and king of Prussia, ruling the German Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia from June 15, 1888 to November 9, 1918. He was the eldest grandson of the British Queen Victoria and related to many monarchs and princes of Europe. Wilhelm became Emperor of Germany in 1888 following the death of Frederick II and the at the time of his accession. Otto von Bismarck was still German Chancellor. However, he was effectively dismissed from office by Wilhelm 2 years later. He also caused a lot of grief between Germany and Britain because of the naval race and the empire. He wanted Germany to have a better empire than Britain and would do anything to lose it. He led Germany to war against France and knew it was coming years before and devised its nuclear plan.
What was that last part? He led Germany to war against France and what?
And he knew it was coming years before and devised its nuclear plan.
Schlieffen plan. Okay, so he had a plan to make sure that he could fight France. Thank you. All right. That is Kaiser Wilhelm II. He came to power in 1888. He was very young, and he didn't like Bismarck's policies of keeping the peace by having alliances with everybody. He came to power when, and by the way, that mustache is waxed, so it goes up. The man was bonkers. I'm telling you, he was bonkers. Not because of the mustache, just his general behavior. I'm reading about him now. He's just,
Fundamentally messed up.
he is the exact example of why monarchies don't work. Because sometimes you have good kings who have made good decisions, then their title passes to their son, who may or may not be sane. He wasn't. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm II had no interest in peace, maintaining peace. He said, Germany is militarily strong, economically strong, but we don't have an empire. How are we going to get it? We got to take it away from other people. So we got to build up our military forces, and we had to take it away from other people. One of the first things that he did was he allowed the treaty with Russia to expire because he thought it was dishonorable to make these contradictory promises. Well, now the Russians are isolated, and they're upset, and they're looking for friends. Lo and behold, they reach out to the French, the other people who feel that they have been humiliated by the Germans. And so now all of a sudden you have a Franco-Russian alliance. On the outsides of Europe and in the middle, a German-Austrian-Italian alliance. Well, this is what Bismarck wanted to avoid. He didn't want Germany to have enemies on both sides. And within a couple of years, or 6 years of his firing, 4 years of his firing, that's what Germany had. But then Kaiser Wilhelm II goes further, and he alienates and upsets the one nation that has tried to stay uninvolved in European affairs. He builds a navy to threaten the British. And the architect of the new modern German navy is this guy, Alfred von Tirpitz. And Eddie, what have you got for me on Tirpitz?
Alfred von Tirpitz was born on March 19, 1849 in Kirchstream in Persian.
Sorry? It's okay. Just speak up a little bit.
Persian province of Brandenburg. He was
the Prussian province of Brandenburg.
He was the son of a civil sergeant. Tirpitz signed up for the Persian Navy in 1865.
Prussian. Persian Navy is Iran. Persia is Iran. Prussia is the biggest part of Germany.
Prussian Navy in 1865 as a midshipman. He attended Kiel Naval School and he also received his commission in 1869. Tirpitz was the man largely responsible for the buildup of the German Navy in years before World War I, and then aggressive naval strategy pursued by Germany during the first 2 years of the war. In 1897, state of the Imperial Navy Department. A year later, he introduced the first Fleet Act, which marked the beginning of the significant reorganization of the buildup of the German Navy. The second fleet in 1900 was way more ambitious. By 1905, German naval strength had exceeded that both France and Russia was on its way towards the goal of becoming a genuine rival for the Royal Navy.
A rival for the Royal Navy of Britain? Okay.
Yeah, this war with Britain, who in 1906 proceeded over the launch of the new battleship.
Invincible?
Yeah.
All right.
Which would become the symbol of the German-British arms race. Leading up to the World War I, 1911 Tirpitz was promoted to the rank of the Grand Admiral.
Admiral, yeah, you got it.
Along with the outbreak of the war, he was made commander of the entire German Navy. He also recognized the deadly German U-boat submarine as his most effective Navy weapon and advocated the aggressive policy of the submarine warfare. In 1915, he was the German.
Hang on. Let me stop you there because now you're getting into World War I. So when we get to World War I, remember submarines, all right? Wonderful. Thank you very much. You know what you forgot to mention? The fantastic beard. Look at that. Somehow in the 19th century, the whole sort of two-pronged beard became very, very cool. So the Germans alienated the British, the one nation that didn't want to be involved in European affairs, by doing the one thing the British could not tolerate, which was building a navy that would challenge their naval supremacy. In a nutshell, Britain is an island. How do they survive? By having a stronger navy than their enemies or potential enemies, to protect from invasion and to protect trade. Well, now the Germans, who not only have the most powerful army on the continent, are now building a modern navy. The battleship, all steel, massive firepower, to challenge British supremacy. And, do we have a map anywhere? Yeah. Here's Germany, here's Britain. They're awfully close. So, how does Britain respond? Britain says, okay, you pushed us into it. We can no longer ignore the rest of the world. So, they first sign an alliance with Japan. Remember Japan, humiliated, but by the end of the 19th century, a modern nation that has to be treated as an equal? In 1902, Britain signs an alliance with Japan. Why? Well, if the Japanese are looking after your interests in the Far East, you can bring some of those ships back home to protect against the German threat. In 1904, the British reach out to the French and they say, you know what, we've had a lot of differences over colonies, especially competition in Africa. The French had helped build the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. It's a shortcut to Asia from Europe. But when Britain took over Egypt in 1882 to protect the Suez Canal, the French couldn't help. They had problems at home. And so Britain took over Egypt, took over the Suez Canal, which the French helped to pay for and build, and the French had never forgiven the British for it. So Britain reached out and said, listen, we're not giving you Egypt. We've had it now for 30 years. Too bad for you. Or 25 years. But we'll give you something in return. We know that you want to conquer the North African nation of Morocco. If you do it, we'll support you internationally. And the French said, so you're going to give us access to new territory, which we were going to take anyway. You're not going to give us back Egypt, which we know you never were going to give us back anyway. And this is the beginning of a relationship against a potential German threat that we both have. Done. 1904, the Entente Cordiale, or Friendly Entente, was signed. It wasn't a military alliance yet, but it was an understanding that whatever problems we have a bigger problem with Germany. So let's work this out, this whole Morocco-Egypt thing. Wilhelm, the crazy German king, is threatened by this British-French-Russian alliance that seems to be aimed at Germany. So he tries to break up the British-French alliance. In Morocco, in 1905, the Emperor of Germany lands in Morocco and declares that he will defend the independence of Muslims in Morocco against European white Christian imperialism. This is the same guy who was conquering Africa at the time. And he demands that the future of Morocco should be discussed at an international conference. So the international conference is called, and what happens? Germany is humiliated. Why? Because everybody goes to the conference and says, are you out of your mind? You're going to start world war over Morocco that few people know where it is on a map, and even fewer care about its future. And you want to start a world war? So Germany is humiliated. France, Britain, Russia, and virtually everybody else are convinced that the Germans cannot be trusted. In 1907, the British reach out to Russia, and they've also had some differences over territory in Asia, and they say, let us settle our differences over territories in Asia because we have a bigger common problem, Germany. And the Russians were happy to do so. By the end of 1907, you now have Britain and Russia, they've formed an alliance. France and Russia have already had an alliance for many years, and Britain and France have signed an alliance in 1904. Collectively, Britain, France, and Russia have now formed the Triple Entente. And this is, where's the map? The Triple Entente. Britain, France, Russia versus Germany, Austria, Italy. Triple Alliance versus Triple Entente. This is the way Europe was divided by 1907. And what happens after that is a whole series of crises which make relations between these countries, these alliances, worse and worse and worse. They keep building up their armies to protect each other against what everyone believes is going to be an eventual war. And then finally somebody does something in 1914 which cannot be forgotten. And there's a collective belief that war is the only solution to this. So, let me start us off and then I'll let you go and I'll pick this up next class. Austria and Russia both want the same thing. They want to expand into a territory in southeastern Europe known as the Balkans. Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, modern-day Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, etc. The Russians want to expand there and to support their Slavic brothers and sisters, people of a similar language and culture. The Austrians want to expand in that territory also, and they resist the development of independent Slavic nations, because if that were to happen, many people in their empire would also want independence, and the empire would collapse. The first crisis that makes Austria and Russia hate each other even more than they already did happened in 1908, the Bosnian crisis. There was a deal worked out. The Austrians wanted to take over Bosnia. The Russians said, we will support you. Hey, hang on. Pack up when I end the class. All right? The Austrians wanted a territory, Bosnia, in southeastern Europe. The Russians said, we'll help you out. But in return, we want support for the ability to sail freely in the Mediterranean, essentially. What ended up happening? The Austrians took what they wanted first. When the Russians asked for their support for what they wanted, the Austrians said, no, we changed our mind. Russia is left humiliated. Why didn't they go to war? Because the Russians knew if you go to war with Austria, who's going to help them out? Who's their ally? Germany. And Russia wants no part of Germany. And certainly France doesn't want war with Germany either over some territory in southeastern Europe. In 1911, you have another crisis, again in Morocco. This time the Germans send a naval ship to Morocco that says, if the French try to take this country, we will defend it. So now you have the entire world looking at Germany saying, you are actually threatening war if France colonizes Morocco, that nobody cares about. The Germans backed down. They were given a little bit of land out of the French Empire to remain quiet. But the result of that was that Britain and France said, okay, we got to step this up a notch. Our militaries and our navies got to start talking to each other because war with Germany is likely going to happen soon. So let's get going. And finally, in 1912 to 13, a whole series of wars took place in southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, where a couple of things happened. A, the Ottoman Empire was defeated, and virtually kicked out of Europe. The remaining lands became independent, and one particular country expanded its borders, Serbia, a strong Russian ally. But it expanded so much that Austria was concerned and demanded that it leave some of its territory behind. And they did so, and the Russians didn't back them up because, again, they didn't want war. So the picture I'm painting for you is this. The first Moroccan crisis, Germany makes a play, loses, humiliated. The Bosnian crisis, Russia makes a play, loses, humiliated. The second Moroccan crisis, 1911, Germany makes another play, loses, humiliated. The Balkan Wars, the Russians try to defend their ally Serbia. They don't push it to the end. They back down. They're humiliated. Germany and Russia humiliated twice each between 1904 and 1913. Both part of larger alliances. Neither one is willing to back down the next time something comes up. And then you've got this, the assassination of the Austrian Archduke on June 28, 1914. We'll cover this at the beginning of next class, wherein, Morgan, you're going to give me Beckman Holweg, all right? And then for next class, everyone already has their assignments, so hand in your Jules Ferry stuff, and thank you.